Hey, this is Matthew Ellison, president at 1615. We are passionate about equipping the people of God for the mission of God. And one of the ways we do that is by providing Great Commission resources, just like the webinar you're about to watch today. We hope you are blessed by what you hear. If you have comments or questions, leave them right here. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the peer-to-peer virtual discipleship series. Today's gathering is titled Help. My pastor doesn't seem to care about missions. My name is Matthew Ellison and I serve as the president of 1615, and normally I would be joined by my good friend and co-host Carlos Negron, but he is experiencing some winter travel complications, as I'm sure many of you relate to. But Maegan Gahima has been the missions director at Parkway Church on the Mountain in Roanoke, Virginia since 2020. She previously served in East Africa, leading community health and development initiatives for gospel-centered nonprofits. Maegan holds a bachelor in interior design from Virginia Tech and recently spearheaded Parkway's 2025 strategic shift to prioritize the Great Commission with the help of 1615. I was witness to this. I was in the room as this vision emerged, and it was beautiful to see the Great Commission move from being part of the church to really becoming the heart of the church. Dustin Spencer serves as the lead pastor at Parkway Church on the Mountain. He's been on staff at that church since 2010, a Liberty University graduate with a Master of Arts in Theology. He focuses on Christ-centered discipleship and staff leadership. And Dustin is currently championing, that's a tough word, championing, the Great Commission vision that emerged over the last year and a half to expand the church's local and global outreach. So Maegan and Dustin, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And again, we need to find an excuse to meet somewhere in the country.
Yeah, we're glad to be here. Thank you for inviting us, for sure.
Thanks, Matthew. So I can kick us off here today. Matthew has become a good friend of Dustin and mine and our whole staff here at Parkway through the coaching process that he has walked us through for the past couple of years, but we'll get to that later. So what we'll start with is just kind of like how we ended up here, because it has been a journey, and I think that it's worth talking about how we ended up where we did. And Dustin can share a little bit about his perspective of being a lead pastor and how God has led him to champion that our mission strategy here at Parkway. So Matthew just kind of wanted me to start with, like, what is God up to at Parkway, and how this missions vision has moved from being just a part of what we do to the heart of what we do. So I wasn't even planning on being in this job as the missions director here at Parkway. I was living in East Africa. I had been there for around 7 years, and I loved my life there. I wanted to stay there, and God had other plans. Like most of you on this call today, you probably weren't planning on being in the position that you're in, and God had a plan and he led you in that direction. So that's kind of where I was. That was about 6 years ago. I was living in Africa, and got a call from Dustin, and our previous missions director, who was part-time. Missions director position at our church has been a part-time role and not a full-time. So Dustin reached out to me and just said, okay, we're looking to hire a full-time missions director, which that was, happening for the first time. That was really encouraging to me, because this had been my home church. Parkway had supported me for those 7 years that I was on the field, and Dustin was actually our executive pastor at the time, our lead pastor. He had been in his role for about 35 years. So he was kind of he knew he was nearing retirement, and Dustin was kind of going to be the next guy in line to be our lead pastor. So Dustin interviewed me during COVID over Zoom. I was in Africa and he was here in Roanoke. And so to make a long story short, I took the job and moved my whole family here to Virginia and didn't really have much of an idea of like how to begin. I had never been in a position of leadership like this before. So I really had to rely on the Lord's direction, how to start. So basically, what I did was I just kind of started with recon. One of my other staff members, that's what they called it. They're like, Megan, you just started out with recon. So that's what I did. I just went out to connect with other missions leaders in our community. And pretty early on in that process, I got connected to Lane Hassan from Rainbow Forest Baptist Church here in Roanoke, and then Robert Mullen, who had been a pastor of a church for quite some time and then was working for another organization called Partners. So these two guys wanted to basically mobilize missions leaders in our area to get their churches involved more in global missions. And so they got this idea to start the Roanoke Area Global Impact Forum. And so when I met Lane and Robert, they had just kind of started this initiative and they invited me to be part of the leadership team. So I took that offer. I didn't feel like I had a lot to offer, just some administrative things that I could do for them, but mainly I just wanted to learn. And so that's what I've been doing the past 6 years is just learning from people who have been doing this a lot longer than me. And I always want to have the heart of a learner. So it was through the Roanoke Area Global Impact Forum that we got connected to 1615 and Matthew Ellison. So that's where it began for us. And the Roanoke Area Global Impact Forum, we decided we wanted to host the Mobilized Church Workshop, which is one of the things that 1615 offers. And at that time, Dustin was just beginning his transition from looking at being the executive pastor to being our lead pastor. So, more on that later. But as we were entering into this mobilized church workshop, um, our pastor of 35 years, as I had mentioned before, um, he cared a lot about missions. We had a missions week for years. We had a sizable missions budget, and a lot of our missionary partners, we had a lot of them. But I would say that in general, um, missions was still a separate department for us. It was a bit siloed. It was not the heart of the church. It was just another ministry that we did. Missions was kind of for the missions people. And I know you guys on here can probably relate to that. You know, missions is sometimes just for the people who have that heart and you kind of call yourselves the missions people or the missions nerds. But in a lot of churches, it's just not it's not for every follower of Jesus. And we know that's not the case, that it is for every follower of Jesus, but many churches have a long way to go in helping their people understand that. And in general, at that point, we didn't have much of a strategic approach. There wasn't really much of a vision for people to catch for God's heart for the nations and what their role in it was. So, yeah, missions was just one of the many ministries of the church, although our pastor did prioritize it at the time. So, this was a shift for a lead pastor when Dustin came along, for the lead pastor to be a champion spearheading missions and from the stage and from every area of what we do. So back to the mobilized church workshop, and I think that that's the key here in our journey, and Dustin will talk a little bit more about this. I'm going to hand it over to him in a second, but with him being able to attend the mobilized church workshop, we had 17 other churches that participated, and Dustin just took his Saturday to do that. And not a lot of senior pastors will give up their Saturday with their family to do a missions conference. And so he did that. And I would say that from my point of view, what he learned at that conference was a turning point in his commitment to make the Great Commission the heart of what we do here at Parkway. And that time really began with an extended period of prayer. and further coaching with 1615. So we cannot overemphasize the power of prayer in this process. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Dustin and let him talk about the journey we've been on as a church and some of the forces and decisions and experiences that led you, Dustin, to this place, putting an emphasis on being a champion for missions.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity here to share a little bit. I'm going to be pretty frank. I hope that's okay with everybody. But yeah, I'll just give a little bit of my experience. I grew up in the church, loved the church, always loved the church, and I've always been kind of connected with missions. But as Megan just shared, a shift did happen for me. So let me take you through that just a little bit. When I was as a youth pastor, I got connected with several short-term missions organizations, and I led several short-term missions with another church that I was serving at. And my wife and I had supported missionaries. And to be honest with you, as we did that process, I'm a pretty analytical person. I like numbers. I like feedback. I like to hear about, is strategy working? What I found, I'm going to use a strong word here, but I think you all kind of probably understand where I'm coming from. I found a lot of grift in missions. I found a lot of people that were just looking for support, and they wouldn't really bring a whole lot of feedback. And it didn't sound like we were winning in a lot of areas. It just sounded like, we would give money to an organization, or we would send a small group to an organization, and you weren't really sure if you're having any effect at all. For that, all that being said, I still knew that missions was, part of God's plan, and that it was our job to get the gospel to all the nations. But man, I just didn't know if the way we were doing it was working. And I carried that into this role as executive pastor at our current church, Parkway Church, and I invited Megan to come on to staff, and I was so impressed with her. And she's very humble, so she'll act like she didn't know a whole lot. But being on the field in the field for 7 years, I think she had learned a lot. And when she began to share with me about how she could tell, when short-term missions groups would come over, or how she interacted with other missionaries, she could tell what were effective and strategies and what weren't effective strategies. So she began to teach us locally at the church what it means to help without hurting, and what it's like to actually have an effective mission strategy. And how a lot of missions organizations and a lot of missionaries and a lot of American supported missions were not really accomplishing those goals. So it was in that context that, as I was thinking about taking over senior pastor, I'm a very numbers driven individual. I want to know that we're having great effect. So I don't know if any senior pastors or lead pastors are going to hear this, but what I would share with them is, my heart was for the local church, because I knew I could count the numbers that were coming in. I could count how many people got saved. I could quantify our success in our area, and that helped me to know that I was doing something good for the kingdom. And when I looked at missions, it just didn't seem like I could do that. I heard these huge numbers, 7,000 unreached people groups, and billions of people that don't know the gospel, don't know the name of Jesus. And I felt like all mission strategy was let's just throw a bucket of water on that inferno, or let's shoot a scatter gun at this and see if we hit something. And that really wasn't all that appealing to me. And as Megan kind of was teaching me and helping me to learn what it was like out there on the field, I think both of us were committed to, we want to do something that actually is effective, that's actually going to work. And not something that's just kind of like, well, we checked the box, we did missions, we did another missions week, we spent some missions money, and now let's focus on what's, quote, really important, the local church. I believe that the local church is the tool that God will use to grow his gospel throughout all the nations. But for me, that was seriously local. And so when Megan invited me to this workshop, I wasn't exactly sure, what the purpose of that was. I do think it was providential. I think the Holy Spirit like poked me to go to it because I didn't really want to, but but it was there where I received the teaching that I needed to understand. And the teaching that I needed was straight out of Scripture. That missions wasn't just a slice of the pie, but it was the heart of the pie. It was the main ingredient. That every single person and every single ministry is on this kind of spectrum, and the end is getting the gospel to all the nations for the glory of God, and how really all ministries need to play a part in that. And so when we started to receive this teaching, there were still questions in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of Megan's mind. How can we actually be effective in that? Because that's a great, I think, overarching goal. Like, we want to be a missions-minded church. I knew that from the beginning. I was convinced, not only through this teaching, but other teaching that I was hearing from pastors, that the heart of every church is to see the gospel go through their local communities, but then also to reach all nations. And I still wasn't sure, well, how do we do that? And so Megan and I went about a process of putting together a strategy. We utilized Matthew in the 16:15. I was thinking another acronym with or another reference with verses. And what is this? This is just another one of those organizations. But thankfully, this Matthew and his team has unbelievable substance. And he came in and he helped us pray through this, and he pointed us in the right direction. And Megan and I worked with a team of lay people and with our leadership to determine, okay, here's an actual strategy that we believe can work. And we began to pray over that, and we began to put that into word form and into our vision. And then we brought that to the church. And now I can tell you, I think we know what our strategy is. I think we know what we're going to attempt to do. And I think that I'm really, really excited. And I actually tell my church this, and the leadership of our church this, is something that's kind of shifted in our thinking and in our conversation. I believe still that we are called to be this local church that has a great effect on our community, and then spreading out to our local region. But I also say this, we can talk about all the things that we want to see God do in salvations around us, all the things we want to see God do in growing our church, maybe planting campuses and all that. But I do think that the greatest impact that we will have as a church long term for the kingdom are the things that we're doing to get His message all the way around the world. And that specifically is, translating His word into an unreached people groups language, and working through strategies to be able to plant a church in a place where the gospel is not really present, and hopefully introducing Jesus to people that never heard of Him before. I think that those are the things that if we accomplish those things over the next 5, 10, and 15 years, will probably have the greatest impact for the kingdom of anything that our church does. And I really do believe that our church has kind of bought that vision, because it is God's vision. And I think that it makes us as a church a part of something a lot bigger than what we would have been just a local organization. So I hope that kind of gives you guys some context on where we came from, and how we worked through that.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. So I think, as you guys can see, Dustin went from kind of being like, ugh, I don't want to spend my Saturday at this, conference, to spearheading a whole vision for our church. And just to kind of summarize, now you guys will get a handout at the end so you don't have to like furiously take notes. If you want to, you can, but we'll have some handouts at the end that'll kind of summarize some of the things that we talked about today. But just in summary, Dustin said he was frustrated. So that is something I think that pastors probably deal with, is the frustration that missions efforts in the past have maybe been expensive, they haven't been super effective, or they haven't seen the fruits from it, or that maybe it was just owned by one person and not the entire church. So that could be, if you're in a church where the pastor may show some frustration or lack of engagement in missions, I think maybe Dustin has shed some light on what some of those reasons might be. Um, and then having humility, that was a key, I think, in his testimony there, is that he just had a willingness to learn because he wanted to do it in a better way, and a more strategic way, and an accountable way. Um, so I think, I would say most pastors do have a desire to be strategic and to be accountable to what they're doing. And if we can provide a way for them to do that, then they may want to engage more in being a part of the process. So I think another step that Dustin mentioned that's really key is the good teaching that he received, this biblical foundation of God's heart for the nations, and then having resources for that healthy, effective partnerships, whatever those look like in your church. So I think that was another reason that he was on board, is because he was able to have that biblical teaching from Matthew and the Mobilized Church Workshop. And then he mentioned the input from me and just seeing what on the field kind of did and didn't work, and being willing to be a learner. So I know some of you may think, well, my pastor doesn't want to be a learner, or he's not interested in learning or coming to a conference. I think that can change. And I do want to, the reason I'm doing this is I want to be encouraging to everyone who may be in this position of saying, my pastor is not too interested in God's heart for the nations, and isn't that why we're the church, and isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? And that can be frustrating, but I think you can see, from Dustin's story, that you can change, and not that he was not about missions before, but it had just not been done maybe in the best ways. So good teaching was a big part of that, and then vision. I think he mentioned vision is so important, and engaging and just developing a long-term strategy with an end goal, clear targets, and tangible steps that gives us a view of God's plan for our church and the world that people can get excited about. Because if you're excited as a missions leader, and your pastor is excited as a lead pastor, and then that flows over to the rest of your staff, or your other missions leaders or ministry leaders, then that's something that your whole church can get excited about and get behind. So it's a process, it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight. As Matthew can probably tell you, it was a journey for our whole team. But what I want to encourage everyone today is with maybe some tips of some things that you can do to engage your pastor and to get on the same page with him or her, and then just some encouragement to not give up in the process. So what I'm going to do
Yeah,
is
could I add to that a little bit, Maegan?
absolutely.
Just from a practical standpoint, I know that our situation may be a little bit different because I was kind of a new lead pastor coming in, and I had a lot to learn, and I just didn't know, and I was frustrated with things I'd seen in the past, but I was really just excited to learn, like what is it? What are we supposed to do? Like, what is the goal? And that's where I think bringing that workshop in and then bringing Matthew in after that was effective. Maybe you're not there. Maybe the church that you're in doesn't have that same kind of thing. But I do believe that most pastors have this beating heart to see the local church grow and to reach those people in that community. And I would just encourage you, that's a great starting place. I think for me, it's certainly that's what my heart, where my heart was. But I think also that there is an opportunity to give them a higher vision, something that's a little bit more broad. Because I do think I talk to a lot of pastors in our denomination and other denominations, and I think there's some consistency amongst pastors that it is a grind and it's not all that easy. And I think, there can be times of discouragement. But I do get so encouraged when I think about our church is doing stuff across the world. We're affecting lives of children with compassion, and we're reaching out and making connections with indigenous missionaries in India and West Africa and in Indonesia. And there's actually a plan for us to make these huge impacts. And so it actually gives my heart some comfort and some joy when I'm going through the grind of trying to grow this local church that God has called me to, that we're a part of a bigger plan. And I do think, just to add to what Maegan just said, I think most pastors are willing to be taught. I just think that you be careful with how you how you go about saying that. And I need to teach you something about missions. Well, that you're probably not going to win them over at that point. But I think understanding what is God's goal for your church. Can you specifically say, what does God want your church to accomplish? And if you can help them through a mobilized workshop or through some good teaching, through 1615, help them to understand that God's plan for every church is a little bit bigger than I think what most pastors have. I think that can unlock a part of their heart that says, well, tell me more and tell me how I can be effective in that. We as pastors are always looking at, we have a limited amount of resources. We have a limited amount of money. We have a limited amount of people. We have a limited amount of volunteers. And if we allow, quote unquote, this is a bad way of looking at it, if we allow some of that money to go overseas and some of those resources to be put into short-term missions and that kind of stuff, it's going to take away from our local environment. Well, I just think that that's upside down thinking. I think that's scarcity thinking. And what I have seen is, if you want a truly engaged church that's giving more, that's more bought into a local mission, they have to have a global mindset. They have to have God's heart for the nations as a part of that. And that begins to expand their vision, and it begins to expand what they're actually a part of. And so I wouldn't give up. Don't give up. I think it's so valuable. And if there's any way that I can help, I'd be glad to. So I just wanted to add those couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. That's really helpful. And I think one other key thing that you and I talked about when we were preparing for this is developing a definition for missions is important, because you may not even be speaking the same language as your pastor. If you understand missions in one way and other people or your pastor define it in a different way, then starting with having the same definition of missions is really important. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I do think in the evangelical church, we've kind of gone pretty far with this idea of everybody's a missionary. And if everybody's a missionary, then nobody's a missionary in a way. And I do think that those are the challenging thoughts that I think pastors have to deal with. What is there a special place in our church or in our heart for those people that say, I want to be sent, I want to be on the front lines of the gospel frontier? Do we find those people? Do we recognize them? Do we lay hands on them? Do we fast and pray over them? And then do we send them out? And is that a part of our process? Because if it's not, we're missing out on probably some people in our congregations that could be called to that. And I do think that there is a distinction for those people that say, just like Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13, who say, yeah, I'm going to go and I want to be sent from a local church. And so I think that's really important too. So alongside the definition of what is missions, what is a missionary, and what does that look like in our church's context?
yeah, and as it just so happens, our host today, Matthew Ellison, wrote a book on that very subject. So if you guys haven't read that, then that would be something to put on your reading list for sure. And Matthew can tell us a little more about that. before we close up today. And there will be a session at the end, a few minutes to do some Q&A. So if you guys have any questions or anything that you can think of, I think you can put them in the chat and we can try and get to those at the end. So I'm going to share my screen just so you're not looking at our faces for so long, and you can see a little bit of the notes that we put together on some tips for missions leaders to get your pastor more engaged in the mission. So the first one that I think it's important to remember is that if you're a missions leader in your church, your pastor does care about missions and your church does care about missions because you've been put in a position of leadership. Whether you are a volunteer leader, a lay leader, or you're on your staff as a missions director or a missions pastor, then there is some investment in you as a leader, and your church does care about missions. So start there and always remember that that's it. Yeah. If you're in leadership and missions, then somebody cares. The second thing I think that is important is just to listen. And I think sometimes we think, okay, our pastor doesn't care much about missions, but have you had a conversation with your pastor and listen to him or her and try to understand, how do they feel? Why is it that they have this view of missions? Maybe it's something that happened in the past. It could be long before you showed up, something that happened that maybe you don't have any idea about. And it could be any variety of things, but that's what I discovered with our previous precious pastor before Dustin. There was some disunity in the church among financial stuff as it related to missions, and I didn't know that. And that was one of the things that was shaping his thoughts and his view on how missions is done. So if you can just sit down with your pastor and have a heart to heart and just find out how they feel, and just kind of get on the same page, and then do it in a way of being having mutual understanding and unity in your relationship. And everything should be based on relationship. So the rest of these, I think I put these together, these tips, based on not necessarily what I did or what I thought I did, but I went to some of my coworkers and I just asked them and even Dustin himself, what are some things that I did as a missions leader that encouraged you as other leaders in the church to be involved in missions? So I kind of got their perspective on some of the things that I did that was helpful for them. So the third one would be just to share your passion with compassion in a way that inspires people rather than points out what's wrong, taking more of a positive than a negative approach, and having that compelling vision that people can see. And you may have part of a vision, you may have a huge vision, you may be a different part in your leadership journey, but if you're sharing that with compassion and having a compelling vision and doing it in a positive way, I think that can go a long way. And I think some people tend to have your favorite missionaries or your favorite places of the world, and your passion is only for those people or places. And I would, that's not wrong. I have those too, but I would discourage it from being just about that all the time. That it would be more of a compelling, bigger vision when you share your passion in missions. Another thing that I was told that I did that was helpful for people is not to ask our pastor or others to do things that we're not doing as missions leaders. So we have to be the example. We need to live it out. which means, are we giving? Are we going? Are we praying? Are we sending? Are we welcoming refugees into our communities? So when other leaders and our pastors see us doing those things, then they're going to be like, okay, this is an authentic passion, and this is something that can spread to other people. So just live it out. The fifth tip would be building trust through meaningful ongoing relationships with the pastor and other ministry leaders. I think that was definitely part of my story. Is it's taken a lot of time just to have that trust in each other as ministry leaders and as pastors, and just to build relationship with each one. And I think that takes intentionality from you as a leader to build relationship and trust with each of the ministry leaders. And don't let it always be about you. And missions, like there's gonna be times they need help in their ministry. So step up, listen to the things that they need, and be willing to help other ministry leaders and other staff members to accomplish their goals, because they're going to be more willing to be a part of what your goals are if you're helping them with theirs. And don't talk about missions all the time. It can't be always about missions. I try to hold back from tying every single thing into missions, even though that's how it is in my mind, and probably a lot of you as well. That's what we're always thinking about because that's our heart, but it can't always be all about missions all the time. So we have to be real with people.
Well, and
Another,
I think Megan, I'll give her credit. She does that very well. I do think she's good at reminding us, hey, it's been a couple of weeks since we've had a missions moment on a Sunday morning, or hey, we got to follow through with this thing that we're doing. But yeah, I mean, I have great confidence and trust that if I talk with Megan about anything in our church, she's not going to turn around and take it as an opportunity to hammer me over the head with some initiative that we have, but I think it's a collaborative thing. So yeah, thanks for saying that.
yeah. Good point. Okay, another thing is sharing resources with a spirit of invitation, not of superiority. So I asked Dustin when we were preparing for this, like, you can't just hand a pastor a book or talk about a workshop or a podcast all the time. He said, I'm willing to accept resources. I like resources. So just to do that with a spirit of invitation, and not a spirit of superiority, like, okay, you should know this about missions and you need to watch this podcast because you don't know, which is probably what we're thinking, but we don't want to say it that way. So just being sharing resources with the right spirit. Um, Also having a missions committee. I know, different churches do it different ways, whether it's a committee or a team, formal or informal, that you're not the only person you're sharing with, or your pastor and your staff is not the only person you're sharing with, that you have a team around you that is on the same page with you, and you're not the only one sharing opportunities, sharing resources, and sharing passion for missions, that you have a team around you that's doing that. So I would say many of you probably already have that, but if you don't, really try and develop a missions team or a missions committee, even if it's just a few people, because that provides accountability as well. Um, the seventh tip would be to maximize every opportunity to share God's heart for the nations with your pastor and other leaders. So someone gave me this tip, and I think it has really worked. Just making the most of conversations. You don't have to give an all-out presentation on missions, and I think that's probably less effective than just dropping ideas, sharing stories in your day-to-day conversations with different people. Maybe it's a staff meeting, maybe it's a team devotional, maybe it's just conversations with individuals in your church leadership or with your pastor. And I think that goes a long way. And it creates a buzz, I think, when, oh, okay, this is happening and that's happening around the world, and people in your office start talking about it. And that just creates an excitement when you maximize opportunities over time instead of waiting just to give one presentation to people. And then evaluate what your church is doing and why you're spending money this way. I think that was a point that Dustin made, is you have to evaluate why and how you're spending your money, and is it being effective? And I think pastors will want to be part of doing that with you, and just having a biblical definition of missions and your church, knowing your church's unique role in that. Um, so when you involve your pastor in that, in this, like, we know that this is a mission that cannot fail. I think Matthew emphasizes that in his coaching, and Dustin and I talk about this. It's like you're on the winning team. We know the end of the story in Revelation. We're all going to be worshiping with all nations, tribes, and languages in heaven, and this is going to happen. So, I mean, what we're doing can't fail. So, who doesn't want to be part of something that isn't going to fail? But I would say you probably need a probably neutral third party person. Like in our example, we had Matthew and we did the coaching with him because it gets us everybody to have a seat at the table that needs to be there. And it has someone help us to look at where we are and evaluate where we are and where we want to go from an outside perspective. And so you might say, well, what if my church is small? We don't have the funds to do things like this. We don't have a workshop in our area. This would not work. I think that there's a lot of resources that MissionNexus has, 1615 has, and some of the other partners and ministries and organizations that provide resources that you can have access to that don't cost a whole lot of money, that help you get on the same page and just evaluate what is your church's role in missions. And then connecting to purpose, just don't make this too personal to you. Connect the vision to God's global purpose and just keep it biblical. All the time based back on God's word, and not just your pet project or a country that you love. Please just let it be about God's heart for the nations and that biblical basis and foundation. And then the last one I cannot probably overemphasize, like I said before, is just praying continually. Schedule it, be intentional, pray for the nations, pray for your missionaries, pray for your pastor. Um, yeah, I mean, involve a prayer time and a prayer team that can be just every week at a certain time praying for all of these things, because this is where God works. The Holy Spirit is at work in all of us, and this is his heart, and he's the one who connects the dots. It's not anything we're going to do that's going to connect the dots. We're just called to be obedient and faithful in prayer. And as you start praying, I mean, you all know God does incredible things. So I don't want to overemphasize the power of prayer in this. Dustin, I don't know if you have any additional comment on the prayer piece. We don't want to over spiritualize the tips for missions leaders, but prayer is obviously key here.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think that that's more of a culture of the church. And I'm grateful that our church does have a pray first culture. But certainly, I think it applies to our, the wondrous works that we want to see God do as He takes the gospel over the world through our hands. Obviously, it's a daunting task. You can't really do it without praying. I mean, that's a silly statement, but it's absolutely true. And I encourage our people from the platform pretty frequently, not only to pray that God will make us worthy of that calling, according to Second Thessalonians, but also to actually pray individually for the strategic people that we've selected to be a part of our missions budget. Pray for those names. And Megan does a great job of providing cards to our groups, our small group communities that has specific names to be prayed for every single month. And so we try to resource our people on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely pray first is part of what we do here. Huge part. Okay, so with those tips, I just will also want to give, as we wrap up and head over to the Q&A, not to give up. because that's why I wanted to do this today, not for me and Dustin to, get any glory from this and say, look what God has done. Well, we want to say, look what God has done and give him the glory, but not to say, look, look at us, look at Parkway. We just want to do this to encourage you to not give up. So, on this last slide here, just to have a fruitful relationship with your pastor. Don't have such a high expectation. And I say this in marriage, like if you expect your husband to be perfect or your wife to be perfect and you have such a high expectation of them, they're always going to disappoint you. So, with same thing, with your
I'll try
pastor.
not to be I'll try not to be offended by that, Megan, but
Well, I will say, and I was going to use this as an example. Yesterday in our staff meeting, we had a mid-year staff meeting, and like all of our people were there, and Dustin calls it the missions department. And I'm like, "Ugh, I thought we were past this of having a missions department." But
yeah.
then at the end, you wrap up the whole thing with, the five Great Commission statements, and this is why we exist as a church, and this is why all of you are here, is, to go and make disciples of all nations. And I was like, okay, he's redeemed himself. So anyway, you do that a lot actually, but we can laugh about it. And I just have to say, like, personally, I'm very proud of Dustin for taking the lead in this. And I just have to remember to have grace. Don't expect perfection.
Mm.
Leave room for your pastor to surprise you. And it's not an overnight shift. It's just a journey. And I would also say don't expect your pastor to do it all. You have other ministry leaders. Involve your worship team. They have a voice on Sunday mornings as well. It's not just your pastor that has a voice. Your worship team can, worship uh, songs about the nations and God's heart for the nations. Be creative. Involve your accounting department. If there's tension about the money and in your accounting department, things are not going to go as smooth. So involving other people to so they all have a heart for the nations and
Yeah,
just
that was a huge
yeah.
win. Megan actually invited our church accountant to go on a missions trip to Turkey, and he went, and it was probably life-changing for him. But that was really creative, a way to involve, the so keeping up with missions trips and monies and all that kind of stuff wasn't as big a burden because he saw the purpose behind it. So we're really smart there.
Yeah, that was fun. And then, finally, just don't be bossy. Just take a spirit of unity and approach where you invite and encourage. And I would also end with saying, I mean, you went on a mission trip, Dustin, but it was on your own time. We already had the strategy. So you didn't go on a trip that was not fruitful before we had a strategy because that would not have been helpful. So, like baiting your pastor by saying, go on this trip and you'll fall in love with these people and then everything will be great is probably not the best approach. Having your pastor go once the strategy is in place and you've got really great partners, then that can further inspire him to be involved.
Yeah,
So,
and
Matthew,
and I
that
would
is all I
say
have.
that's a possibility that it could backfire too, because a lot of pastors that I
Mhm.
talk to go on one or two short-term missions, become very connected to one individual or one pastor, and all of a sudden, all missions in that church is focused on that one church or that one pastor, and sometimes that's not a healthy relationship because it doesn't allow the missions home team or whatever you would call your group that's making decisions for missions to expand beyond that. The pastor's like, what about this one guy that I really like? Because I went and saw him one time. And so I think that can backfire on you. Yeah, keep it more global. So thanks, Meg.
Yep, good point. Thanks, Dustin. All right, back to you, Matthew.
Well, thank you both so much. Again, I was witness to all this. I was in the room as the Holy Spirit was guiding you, leading you. It was such a joy to see you both align and to see a whole body get mobilized. I wrote a bunch down. There were so many great phrases. Leave room for your pastor to surprise you. Megan, that's gold right there. I think just not expecting too much and leaving room for your pastor and for God to surprise you. That really hit me. And this idea of when you do present resources, because Dustin, you talked about how training and education was pivotal. I mean, the light went off, but as you pointed out, Megan, don't present those with an air of superiority, like, how come you don't know this? But come with humility. So some real gold, came out of that. Megan, really briefly, why this is populating. You talked about the importance of a missions definition, and Dustin, you reinforced that as well. Can you kind of talk about how how that came about? Um, I know that when you challenge the idea that everyone's a missionary, and you challenge the idea that everything may not be missions, that it can be a difficult conversation. Any suggestions on what that looks like or how to go about that?
Yeah, I think this is a critical idea. And, I would say that for me, I would approach it because, not everyone on our staff kind of wanted to jump on board with that idea,
Mhm.
because it's been something we've been taught really in evangelical Christianity for 30, 40 years. And some of our pastors have been doing it for a long time and have close to their heart to say, hey, everybody's a missionary. Go out and be a missionary in your mission field. And I think it was helpful for me to back off of using that word or those phrases and just to say, well, what are we going to call those people that we're sending to the front lines? And I kind of equate it in my own mind to, an army. In the time, World War II, everybody in America came together to go win the war, right? And like, there were lay people all over the place, not soldiers that were putting forth effort to go and win the war. But there was still a special place for those that signed up to say, hey, I want to be on the front line. I actually want to go and push the enemy back. And however you need to do that to define that for your people or for your senior pastor, there needs to be strategy around how are we as a church supporting people on the front line? How are we as a church really helping those people that are trying to push the enemy back, trying to gain ground for the kingdom in places where, there is no light? And so no matter how you have to do that, for some people, they're always going to say missions is for everybody. Missions is everybody. Well, then change your phrasing a little bit and say, okay, what about those global missionaries that we're sending to actually go gain ground for the kingdom? I think that was an important shift for us.
Megan, any thoughts on that one? Because I know this is a point of contention with a lot of missions teams and senior leadership. Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a deal breaker, honestly. I mean, because in the end, I think we did in our coaching with you develop uh, that definition. Not everyone is a missionary.
Hmm.
And going back to all of those, you know, original languages of the Bible, and I cannot quote it all the way that you do, Matthew, but having that shared definition within your teams, but it's not like you're gonna necessarily go out and give those definitions to your whole congregation. Like that's not, I don't think for us that wasn't the goal. It was just in the way that we as leadership speaks, we can influence the way people think about, because I'm the missions director, or so Neighbors and Nations is the name of our strategy that we came up with
Hmm.
as a team. And, it's built on Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And the and is important. So, our local stuff is outreach and evangelism, and our global stuff is what we consider global missions. So I think that's an easy way to explain it to people
Hmm.
without having to get into the whole definitions argument with a congregation. It's just a mutually shared definition as leadership, and then that influences the way that we share with everyone else.
Yeah, that's good. So you mentioned the book. You guys have done a total commercial for 1615 today, and I would add Missio has a bevy of resources as well. Carlos Negron, who's the director of church partnerships, does these Nexus events. Something that stood out to me today several times, and again, thank you for the encouragement, both of you. But the effectiveness of having someone objective from the outside coming in with what I call fresh eyes, whether that's a Carlos, Matthew Ellison, someone from our coaching team, I think it can be really helpful getting missions and church leaders aligned by bringing someone in from the outside who doesn't have a bias, who's there to guide a conversation and lead a dialogue. So that stood out to me today, the value of having some outside help coming in.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that
would
was
say for
key.
my part, I would agree with that. I would say also, I was blessed without having a long history of this is how I've always done it. So I don't know how well I can speak to
Yeah,
that, but I have been a part of this staff for a while, and I would say that it was going to take a little bit of a fresh look for us to really
yeah.
kind of shift what we're doing.
So, Dustin, I'm going to get really nitty gritty here.
Let's go.
How often are you incorporating missions theology into your teaching? Or what does that look like? Just maybe in general, what does that look like? How do you integrate it into your overall teaching, schedule?
Yeah, so it started intentional and now it's natural.
Hmm.
And I think that it's just the way that you begin. As I shared with Megan before, once you begin to see the nations, you can't unsee the nations. And so like for instance, I just got finished with our with kind of putting the buttoning up their sermon for Sunday, and I mean it's all about Jesus's authority over the nations and what happens when he returns. So I would say, as an encouragement, you might not hear much missions conversation coming out of your pastor's heart right now. But I think if you go through the process of making it a vital part of the vision of the church, it will naturally spew out of his mouth as he preaches. And so yeah, I had to think in those terms, I think, a lot in the beginning, but I don't really have to think in those terms now. And I think I don't know, Megan, you could probably say that it probably comes out naturally. You don't have to wait to hear about the nations or what we're trying to accomplish for our missions weeks that we specifically set aside. I think you're hearing it most Sundays.
Yeah, for sure. I think Matthew calls that the beeline to the plot line.
Yeah.
Uh, so yes, I think, you can't expect your pastor to preach a mission sermon every Sunday,
No.
and that's just not realistic, but he doesn't have to. Like Dustin just said, it just comes out. And it's
Mhm.
like God's heart for the nations is everywhere in the Bible. So there's always a way to tie it in. It's like there's a low hanging fruit somewhere and it's just easy to grab. You don't have to plan a whole mission sermon. When your pastor begins to think that way, it becomes easy to tie it in most Sundays.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, make a beeline to the plot line is a saying from J.D. Payne. I'm actually in Birmingham right now doing a thought leader briefing on the Sending Shepherd tomorrow at Samford University, where JD is a missions prof. But this idea is when you teach a message, when you craft a message, just pause before you deliver it and say, is there an opportunity to anchor this teaching into the larger redemptive plot line? Sometimes the answer is no. But many times there's missions implications that are overlooked that are just right there staring at you, like David and Goliath, of course, right? We know that story to be a story about a little kid taking out a giant, but there's a global implication. God's heart for the nations is revealed in that passage because he says, when I kill you, the whole world will know there's a God in Israel. So that's the idea of making a beeline to the plot line. On that note, again, you talked about the importance of teaching, training, education. Like this light went off, Dustin, through the mobilized church. There's so many great resources out there. God's Heart for the Nations is an 8-week conducted Bible study. Missio's got resources as well. But some of those resources that will help fan that missions flame in the heart of your leaders. I'm going to make one final comment because we're about at our time here. Um, but just this idea of humility, the posture of humility that was happening in your life, Megan. I'm going to brag on both of you. So I'm going to destroy your humility here, right? Because I'm going to brag on you guys. No, I'm just kidding. But there was a humility that you had, Megan. You were winsome. You wore your convictions with tenderness and, you know, it was strong, but it was winsome. And Dustin, as a senior leader, saying, I got things to learn. And when you have the humility on both sides of this, it's amazing what can happen. So I guess my final encouragement for everyone listening, whether you're a church missions leader or you're a pastor, humility will go a long, long way in moving the missions needle as you try to get on the same page here. So thank you guys for demonstrating that to us and, modeling that for me. And thank you both for sharing today. It's been a blessing. Well, we hope you are blessed by what you heard today.
To learn more about the ministry of 1615 and how we serve churches, simply log on to 1615.org. And by the way, don't forget to like and subscribe.